Ring-a-ring-a-rosy, a pocket full of posies. Achoo, achoo, we all fall down.
A children's rhyme we all grew up with. But if the words seem a little odd, it's because it's the original 18th century version, and it's associated with a terrible event, the plague. In a time when even simple bacterial infections were fatal, the plague wiped out half of Europe's population. To children, the rosy ring was a telltale rash. Posies were herbs and spices carried to ward off disease, and sneezes were the first symptom of this deadly bacterial infection. Infectious disease-causing agents, called pathogens, have existed as long as we have. They're found in the air we breathe, in the foods we eat, and on nearly every person or object we come into contact with. At one time, most diseases were thought to be caused by a single factor. Now we recognize that infectious diseases often are caused by multiple factors, both inside and outside a person. For a disease to occur, the host must be susceptible, which means our immune systems must be in a weakened condition. An agent capable of transmitting a disease must be present, and the environment must be just right for the pathogen in terms of light, moisture, and temperature. There are also a number of risk factors which play a role in our susceptibility to disease. Some risk factors we can control, and some we can't. One risk factor beyond our control is our heredity. If your parents, grandparents, brothers or sisters have developed certain diseases at early ages, you're probably at increased risk for those diseases. Another risk factor you can't control is aging. It has been shown that after the age of 40, we become more vulnerable to many chronic diseases. Still, a third risk factor you can't control are environmental conditions. Unsanitary conditions in the presence of drugs, chemicals, and hazardous pollutants in our food, water, and air are believed to have an effect on our immune systems. Now, let's look at some risk factors we all have some degree of personal control over. They include the stress in your life, your diet, getting enough exercise and sleep, use of alcohol and other drugs, and high-risk behaviors. All these factors can have a significant impact on your ability to fend off infections and diseases. How, you ask? Pathogens enter the body in several ways. They may be transmitted during direct contact between infected persons, such as during sex, kissing, or touching. Or by indirect contact, such as touching an object an infected person has touched. As you might have guessed, the hands are the greatest source of transmission. Another way pathogens are transmitted is by airborne contact, a sneeze, or just breathing in air containing a pathogen. Animal-borne pathogens are carried in the bites or feces of dogs, cats, livestock, and wild animals. Pathogens can also be transmitted by food. Recent outbreaks of E. coli bacteria caused great concern in the United States and throughout the world. The cause is a particular strain found most often in meats people eat, although other incidents of infection have occurred from non-meat sources as well.
The important thing to remember about foodborne disease is that some foods are intrinsically contaminated. In other words, foods that come from animal origins, like meat and poultry and such, carry bacteria that are normal organisms in the gastrointestinal tract of those animals. So that when someone slaughters the animal, occasionally the bacteria get onto the surface of the meat. So that raw meat and poultry is likely to be contaminated with bacteria that can cause disease.
Bacteria are just one type of potential disease-causing pathogens. Others include viruses, fungi, protozoa, rickettsia, and parasitic worms. The two most common pathogens are bacteria and viruses. Bacteria are single-celled plant-like organisms which cause disease from the toxins they produce. Although there are several thousand species of bacteria, only about 100 cause diseases in humans. Diseases caused by bacteria include strep throat, pneumonia, tetanus, tuberculosis, toxic shock syndrome, diphtheria, and cholera. The E. coli outbreaks have raised concern among health officials as they search for the best preventive strategies for what is a particularly deadly strain of the bacteria. The best strategy lies in our handling of foods.
If you take a steak and you cook it so that it's medium rare, you've killed the bacteria that are contaminating on the outside. But when you take a hamburger or a ground beef product, what you're doing is you're grinding it up, so you're taking the outside and you're putting it on the inside. So now, if you cook that and don't cook the center, you're going to have bacteria present that you're going to be consuming. The other thing that can frequently happen is that a food that does not have any bacterial contamination can become contaminated by mishandling in a kitchen.
Do you take proper precautions? Improper food handling turned out to be the culprit behind a mysterious illness on the University of Georgia campus.
When we went to investigate it, we found that the illness was primarily occurring among students who were for the first time living in apartments, preparing food for the first time, and often doing things that were essentially a risk for the transmission of Campylobacter. For example, Campylobacter is a very common contaminant of raw poultry, and many of these students were not familiar with handling the poultry products and were essentially contaminating various products in their kitchen and undercooking the product.
See how easy it is to spread contamination from one food to another? So what do?
We can make sure that when we get a food that we keep it refrigerated or frozen before we cook it, and then after we cook it, we either promptly refrigerate it, freeze it, or we keep it hot. In other words, we don't want to provide the conditions that allow bacteria to grow and multiply.
Viruses are the smallest of the pathogens. Presently, over 150 viruses are known to cause diseases in humans. Some diseases caused by viruses are relatively harmless, like the common cold, fever blisters, and warts. Others are serious and can cause permanent damage or even death. Among the more serious diseases caused by viruses are AIDS, measles, influenza, hepatitis, smallpox, polio, encephalitis, mumps, and herpes. A viral disease that has received a lot of media coverage is Ebola, which causes a painful death in 8 of 10 victims. While Ebola and the other diseases can be frightening, you don't have to stay in bed the rest of your life to avoid getting them. That's because your body fights back. It has natural defenses that are very effective in providing a barrier against pathogens. Your greatest defense is your skin, which is layered in a way that allows few pathogens to enter. In addition, your body's secretions, such as sweat, tears, and earwax, contain enzymes which destroy microorganisms. Mucous membranes in the respiratory tract and other linings of the body trap and engulf invading organisms. If pathogens are able to get by the first barrier of defense, your immune system produces antibodies to fight infections and white blood cells to destroy invaders. How healthy is your immune system? Some pathogens, like E. coli and the Ebola virus, have developed ways to get around the body's natural defenses. Sometimes that's due to certain behaviors that help a pathogen enter our system. Certain sexual practices, for example, can make us susceptible to sexually transmitted infections.
There are an awful lot of STDs out there, and there's a huge chunk, estimates vary, of what fraction of the general population this day and age is going to become infected with some sexually transmitted disease.
It's very important to seek treatment early if you notice any symptoms of an STI. Too often, the embarrassment some people feel prevents them from getting help. But failure to do so can result in serious health problems. One of the most prevalent sexually transmitted diseases, especially among heterosexual white Americans, is chlamydia, a bacterial infection which infects over 10% of all college students. Chlamydia symptoms can sometimes be overlooked until more serious damage occurs. Gonorrhea is treatable with a regimen of antibiotics, but women don't usually have the obvious symptoms men do until much later in the disease, making it easier for it to go untreated. Syphilis is also treatable with antibiotics and has distinct phases. Primary syphilis is characterized by a chancre or open sore, usually at the site of infection. The chancre will completely disappear in 3 to 6 weeks, so it's important to catch the disease early. Herpes is a viral disease which causes recurring, painful blisters. Although there is no cure at this time, certain drugs have been developed to reduce symptoms. Pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID, is not actually a sexually transmitted infection, but rather a term used to describe a number of infections of the uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries. Although PID can result from non-sexual causes, it is often the result of an untreated sexually transmitted infection. And there are others.
Human papillomavirus infection is the virus that causes warts, some strains of which are associated with cervical cancer. That infection has been found in close to half of college-aged women in some studies, for example, who are asymptomatic.
The rise in sexually transmitted infections in America is particularly worrisome to health officials because of the long-term and even lethal consequences, and also because of the lack of awareness of the problem's existence. This problem of obscurity is due in great part to the attention focused on another serious problem closely associated with sexual practices.
In the United States, I believe the #1 health issue is AIDS.
AIDS is the #1 health issue in America today.
AIDS. It has to be AIDS.
Probably the most lethal virus we know about now is the AIDS virus. We believe that very close to 100% of people that are infected with the AIDS virus will eventually come down with symptoms of AIDS and will eventually die of those symptoms.
Although researchers now believe the AIDS virus was probably around 30 to 40 years ago, it wasn't until the early 80s when health officials recognized a disturbing health pattern among gay men that people became aware of a new and deadly disease. Within a few years, epidemiologists had narrowed down the cause, a special virus we know today as the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV.
HIV is a retrovirus. I'm sure people have heard that term. There are viruses that have pieces of DNA in their genetic code, like we have DNA in our genetic code. There are viruses that have RNA for their genetic code, whereas humans use RNA sort of as the translating step. Our DNA creates RNA, and the RNA goes through ribosomes, makes proteins, builds cells, so forth. With HIV, it's an RNA virus with a twist. It's got an enzyme called reverse transcriptase that once the virus gets inside your cell, that enzyme takes its RNA and goes backwards. In a sense, it makes DNA from the viral RNA. Then, through a step using an enzyme called endonuclease, that piece of DNA gets plopped right into your DNA, where it sits. And that's how it works. That's the tricky part. Now the code for the virus is sitting in the human cell. And when it gets turned on, the human cell goes about the business of creating building viral proteins.
In identifying the virus, scientists have been able to understand its actions, predict its behaviors, and determine how it's transmitted. We now know that HIV is not transmitted through casual contact, but rather through the exchange of certain bodily fluids: blood, semen, vaginal secretions, and in some cases breast milk transmitted from infected mothers to their nursing infants. Exchange of such fluids is most likely to occur during unprotected intercourse or through multiple use of injectable needles. Although initially people were infected through other means, such as transfusion of tainted blood and blood byproducts, such cases are less common now due to public safety precautions. So if the virus can only be transmitted through specific behaviors, how did it spread?
We'll talk about where the virus was first identified. What we were really finding is where that virus was first seeded into a population, where there was an amplification system in place, if you will, that allows it to really take off. And that's why, more than anything else, the virus is spreading through different modes, primarily in different parts of the world. In the Western world, what was going on, we'd just come through the sexual revolution here. And especially for gay men, finally being able to come out of the closet in significant numbers, there was, for a fraction of that community, a pendulum swing over to the phenomenon of bathhouses and other ways in which a few gay men were having very large numbers of partners, and a difficult-to-transmit infection could get well seeded into that population to start your epidemic wave. What was going on with injection drug users in this country? Well, we had paraphernalia laws, so that if you're an injection drug user and you're shooting something up, if you get caught with that needle in your pocket, it's just as good as getting caught with the dope. You go to jail for that. So the tradition sprang up of essentially renting your works from the guy who sold you the dope. So you buy your dope, you shoot it up right there, you give everything back to him, so you don't have to carry any evidence around with you. And that's the origin of shooting galleries, where an injection drug user could share, a single needle could be shared among 200 injection drug users in a single night. So, yeah, it may be a difficult-to-transmit infection, but with that kind of a system in place, you can really get it well seeded into that population. Getting it seeded is very important, because if you stop and think about it, what gets anybody infected is a really simple mathematical equation. It's what you're doing, what risks you're taking.
So international efforts have been focused on educating people about preventive behaviors to reduce the practice of high-risk behaviors that make the exchange of bodily fluids likely. Do you think you place yourself at risk for HIV infection? So what do you do if you think you may have been exposed to HIV?
The standard, still most recommended way to screen yourself for HIV infection is through the antibody testing process. There's a screening test, and if it's positive, there's more screening tests, and if one of them is positive, then there's a confirmatory test, all that stuff. You don't have to know all of that. It's an antibody test, okay? It takes a while for people to develop antibodies to anything. HIV is no exception. To develop antibodies to HIV, most people have antibodies within a few months, 2 or 3 months. 6 months is pretty much a good sort of outside limit. There may be rare cases of people taking longer, but 6 months is what most people say you can be pretty comfortable with in terms of developing antibodies to HIV. So if you're getting screened for HIV with an antibody test, all it tells you is whether you were infected with HIV up to a point 3 to 6 months ago. It doesn't tell you after that. So if you've done something last weekend you're worried about, rushing out and getting a test is not going to help you. The other very, very important thing about testing is that it's a means to an end. Antibody testing should be used because you're concerned about maybe what has happened in the past with an eye toward changing that in the future. If you turn up positive, you certainly need to change your behavior so that you're not going to be transmitting it to somebody else. And if you turn up negative, you certainly need to change your behavior about whatever you were worried about before so that you stay negative and you don't have to worry about it in the future.
Each day, numbers of people throughout the world are told they are HIV positive. Many others walk around as carriers without even knowing it.
When I came to Shanti, I had a very, very bad attitude. I had an attitude, I was ready to die. I said, I have no reason to live. AIDS is going to kill me. I just will go ahead and kill myself. Well, Shanti, a few people here at Shanti said, no, you're not going to die. You're living with AIDS. And they started pushing positive mental attitude, PMA. Positive mental attitude is a healing motion. I've learned that in my positive thinking, that if I decide to do something, and I think very positive about it, it's going to happen.
Live life to the fullest. Today I'm living. Before I was dead, I'm alive today, and that's a true blessing for me. You know, I have a lot to live for, and I refuse to, I'm very determined, and I refuse to just, because I have a disease, to just let it go, just die and wither away.
For many people living with HIV, or the last stage of the infection, AIDS, the diagnosis of HIV positive was once a death sentence. But today, people are living much longer with the infection than in the early years due to special drugs like AZT, DDI, and DDC. And in recent years, research has unveiled even more encouraging signs.
More recently, we've finally begun to get different tools. And there are also 3 new protease inhibitors out that people can use. And people have learned, as expected, that multiple combinations just of these 2 kinds of drugs seem to help a lot for people with HIV infection, especially if they haven't been treated before and they haven't developed resistance one at a time to the one drug that was being used, and then that one you develop resistance to, let's give you a different drug, and you develop resistance to that, let's give you a different drug. So now that all these tools are available and people can take 2 or 3 drugs at a time of different classes, it seems to be making much more of a difference in terms of keeping people healthy longer. So a cure is going to be a tough thing. In practical terms, we may get to the point where it's a well-managed condition and people can be very healthy and live, if we're really lucky, normal lifespans. Or maybe it will remain more difficult to keep under control. But in any case, it's going to be much more manageable than it ever has been before, especially if people begin treatment early and begin treatment with multiple drugs. It's going to keep developing, and the future is better and better in terms of the science and the ability to take care of people. It's only the cost that's going to hold us back now.
And now it's up to you. You can take steps to protect yourself from HIV infection or other sexually transmitted infections. It begins with practicing responsible behaviors. For some, this means abstaining from sex until committing to a lifetime relationship. For others, responsible behavior means taking the precautions necessary to protect themselves and their partners. These precautions include: avoid casual sex, particularly with someone who has a history of practicing high-risk sexual behaviors. Use latex condoms or dental dams during all forms of intercourse. Never, never share injectable needles. These include drug needles and needles used for any form of body piercing. And be sure your health care providers always use instruments that have been properly sterilized in an autoclave. Avoid behaviors that can cause injury to body tissues during sex. And finally, educate yourself about HIV infection and sexually transmitted infections. Know your risks. Responsible behavior is about mutual respect, and this is best reached by being able to communicate with your sex partner. Be direct, honest, and determined in talking about sex. Encourage your partner to be honest and share feelings. Before you become involved, know your partner's HIV status and sexual history. Talk about what monogamy means to you and the importance of a committed relationship. It's also important to analyze your beliefs and values ahead of time. If you know where you stand, it's a lot easier to draw the line.
I'm struggling with both, more like a morality issue, I guess, because and a health issue because with the AIDS virus, and but more from my religion and stuff. You know, it's not really accepted, I guess. So, you know, that I'm kind of struggling with that in a way.
Now examine your own lifestyle. In order to prevent infectious diseases, do you receive adequate rest and nutrition? Do you get regular exercise? Are you aware of the stresses in your life and the ways you can reduce them? If you're sexually active, do you use protection? Not just when you remember, not most of the time, not 95% of the time, but every time. How often do you use protection?
99.99999%.
All the time.
100%. I always use those things.
Honestly.
About 90%.
Ring-a-ring-a-rosy, a pocket full of posies. Achoo, achoo, we all fall down.